Horror movies are supposed to scare you, not put you in the hospital. These iconic movies manage to cross that line.
Fainting, vomiting, ambulances. Here's why Art the Clown's masterclass on brutality is making people physically sick. It's always impressive to see a low-budget independent horror flick break into the mainstream consciousness in the manner that Terrifier 2 has. Slasher villains often stand out among horror characters because they firmly put a face to the madness. And few screen killers in recent memory have committed to cementing a more haunting image than that of Art the Clown.
Oh my god, you're never gonna believe what I just heard on the radio.
You've seen your killer clowns, whether from the far reaches of space or the murky depths of Maine. But you've never seen a clown quite like Art. Even if you've never seen his movies, you've likely seen his demented face. Art was initially a through-line antagonist in director Damien Leone's 2013 anthology flick, All Hallows' Eve, which itself was composed of the filmmaker's short films from years past. Initially played by Mike Gianelli, it was David Howard Thornton who would secure the pantomime killer's legacy in 2016's Terrifier. Where All Hallows' Eve was a sort of test run for the character, Terrifier was where the clown prince of grime made himself known, with Terrifier 2, a sequel that has been eliciting the kind of bodily reactions that even the most jaded horror fanatic couldn't have imagined. According to a report from USA Today, it appears that the film is too extreme for some people, prompting them to either faint or resort to vomiting. Even an ambulance had been called to one theater. It got to the point where Steve Barton, the film's executive producer, had to tweet out a viewer discretion warning. Most horror movies wish they could get this kind of hyperbole about how scary or gross the experience is, but Terrifier 2 is one that actively deserves it. Saw used to be the gory Halloween splatterfest folks went to see around this time of year, but even Jigsaw would feel compelled to tell Art to chill. Terrifier 2 is an ugly movie born in blood that somehow slithered onto the screens of an AMC theater near you. It's probably the closest you'll come to a contemporary horror film capturing the sickeningly sadistic glee of the Grindhouse days. You've seen violent movies before, but this will seriously test your limits.
Stay back. Stop, please, stop. Stay away from me. No, please.
The first Terrifier features one of the most graphic kills you'll see in any horror movie. Art has one of his victims hung upside down with their legs spread open, and he proceeds to saw them in half. From groin to brain, you witness every gory detail. If that was too much to stomach for you, skip the sequel. Terrifier 2 finds more horrifically creative methods of mutilating the human body, discovering new and unfathomable limits. The makeup effects in Terrifier 2 are so unnerving because the kills themselves are often agonizingly slow. Art revels in the thrill of the kill and forces you to experience it with him. Director Damien Leone places a heavy emphasis on practical effects, and they're astounding stuff. The incredibly talented makeup effects team deserves all the praise in the world for pulling these scenes off. It would appear, however, that Leone himself has mixed feelings on the reports emanating from his film. Speaking with Entertainment Weekly, Leone says that while he was happy that Terrifier 2 was doing well, he's not into the idea of his movie requiring the need of paramedics at movie theaters. He said, "Listen, I would have loved to have a couple of walkouts. I think that's sort of a badge of honor because it is an intense movie. I don't want people fainting, getting hurt during the movie, but it's surreal. Here's the thing, it's called Terrifier 2. You should probably see Terrifier 1 before you jump into this one. If you see Terrifier 1, you know what you're getting into." It's easy to see where Leone is coming from. It doesn't help if you walk into a sequel not knowing that its predecessor already pushed the limits of gore in horror movies. But at the same time, both Terrifier films are a provocative spectacle, and Leone knows this. It's difficult for people to look at the reports and not want to go see what everyone is talking about. Those who aren't even familiar with the first Terrifier will want to see if its sequel lives up to the headlines. That's the nature of word of mouth, for better or worse. Even if you've never seen a Friday the 13th or a Nightmare on Elm Street movie, you're likely familiar with Jason Voorhees and Freddy Krueger through cultural osmosis alone. The folks who have never even heard of Art the Clown are rapidly becoming acquainted with the slasher's existence. It all comes down to the look. Art checks all of the boxes regarding creepy killer clowns. He's got the white makeup, the floppy shoes, the face paint, and a jaunty disposition. Thornton is a force of nature in the costume, utilizing his expressive face to conjure an ordinary slasher into something uniquely memorable. Despite checking all of the clown prerequisites, the pantomime slasher never speaks. Even when he laughs, Art doesn't actually make a sound. It's Thornton's menacing grimace that ties it all together. While Terrifier 2 has been making the rounds for its graphic kills and the reactions that followed, it's also worth noting that the horror sequel has also been garnering positive reception from both critics and genre fans. The film's target audience actually likes the movie. A common criticism lobbied against the original Terrifier was its lack of a story, coupled with its acts of misogynistic brutality. For 85 minutes, Art hacks and slashes his way through his victims with little to tie it all together. Terrifier 2, however, switches things up with the inclusion of Lauren Lavera's Sienna, a teenage girl who is actually propped up as a formidable challenger to Art's reign of terror. The film follows her story just as much as Art's, adding a supernatural intrigue as to what the demon clown could possibly be. Lavera's performance is a massive step up from whatever the cast of Terrifier was doing the first time around, and it actually gives you someone to follow in the midst of all the carnage. Since slasher flicks are rarely as long as Terrifier 2, the film has this disorientating effect where it makes you feel like you're slowly losing your mind as the depravity on screen unfolds. It's the kind of movie where every reaction, anger, disgust, and amazement, is an equally valid response. You likely won't see another movie as dedicated to making you squirm in your seat this Halloween than Leone's demented horror show. Terrifier 2 may or may not be a movie you like, but one thing's for sure, you will never forget it.
It's not surprising that Terrifier 3 is making people sick in the same way that Terrifier 2 did back in 2022. But is it bringing people to the breaking point even faster than before? This time around, Art is rampaging at Christmas time, and if you thought that the spirit of the season would tone things down a bit, you were gravely mistaken.
That is so messed up!
Representatives for the film later confirmed that there were 11 total walkouts, in addition to the person who got sick. Director Damien Leone took to X and addressed the situation, saying, "I did personally witness some crazy stuff at this UK screening. These are not the first reports of the film's over-the-top gore. Actor David Howard Thornton, who portrays Art the Clown, was nearly sick over one scene he had to film for Terrifier 3. Leone tweeted at the time, "Can honestly say we just filmed one of the most insanely horrific scenes of the Terrifier franchise, and you'll never believe who couldn't handle it on set." Thornton later admitted that it was him and added in a thread, "This was the first kill that almost made me vom. That's a first." Those are the people making the movie. For certain uninitiated audience members, the sheer amount of gore in an unrated slasher such as this is going to come as a surprise. Without getting into spoilers, we can confirm that the opening minutes of the film are rather disturbing. Hardened fans of horror, and this franchise in particular, are likely anticipating that. Casual viewers, on the other hand, need to be prepared for what they're about to get into. Leone previously warned us in an interview with The Independent, "If you thought Art the Clown's reign of terror in Part 2 was extreme, you haven't seen anything yet."
We both know this isn't over.
This is why he avoided making a sequel with a major Hollywood studio after the success of Terrifier 2. He wanted to keep the franchise as gory as possible, and Hollywood studios weren't having it. As he told Lad Bible, "I got to meet with studios, like legit Hollywood studios, who wanted to make Terrifier 3. I knew they weren't going to let me make this movie based on the first pages. Like, that's how insane Terrifier 3 is. It is just a movie, but it's one that is designed to test the limits of what viewers can endure."
Don't eat before watching this upcoming IFC Films flick, or you might just make a mess. Is In a Violent Nature really as sickening as people say? Unlike big-budget blockbusters that often depend on famous faces or explosive and expensive set pieces to draw audiences into the theater, the horror genre has been thriving for decades with no-name actors, shoestring budgets, and still pulling in huge profits, thanks to a quality idea that audiences want to see. If the characters in the film are more than likely not going to make it to the end credits, there's no need to shell out the dough for a household name when they're just going to be killed off. Fortunately, horror films also frequently inspire unprovoked reactions from audiences that work better than any marketing campaign ever could. A24 struck gold when audience members were reportedly fainting during preview screenings of Talk to Me, which certainly helped skyrocket the film's popularity and contributed to it becoming the production company's highest-grossing horror film ever, even surpassing Ari Aster's Hereditary.
Run!
IFC Films and Shudder have now been given a similar gift, with their art house slasher gore fest In a Violent Nature reportedly making audiences gasp and even vomit. Audio that was secretly recorded during the Chicago Critics Film Fest screening allegedly captures folks being extremely freaked out, and reports of someone being so disgusted by the film that they threw up in the middle of the movie.
In a Violent Nature is a slasher film that follows the slasher villain, instead of the teenage victims trying to survive the slaughter. If you've ever wondered what Michael Myers is up to during the scenes when babysitters are smoking weed or walking home from school, In a Violent Nature focuses on that story. And for the most part, the slasher named Johnny is just trekking through the woods. And sometimes In a Violent Nature feels like watching a video game walking simulator. But this intentional pacing is meant to lull the audience into a false sense of comfort, because when Johnny's path finally does cross with a group of friends in the woods, he executes kills that would make Jason Voorhees proud. The walking scenes are ambient and calm, which gives the kills a space to be as over-the-top as possible. One moment in particular, undoubtedly the scene that reportedly made someone barf in their seat, is one of the most creative kills in recent memory, outdoing even the gorehound favorite Terrifier 2. Considering how extreme the violence is compared to how disarming the lead-up is, it is a very jarring whiplash for folks who aren't prepared to watch a body destroyed in ways never thought possible. Is In a Violent Nature a non-stop bloodbath of gross-out torture porn? No, but it is extremely effective in its execution, and will certainly catch some viewers off guard with just how intense the kills get, especially those shot in broad daylight. Fortunately, In a Violent Nature is a genuinely interesting movie in its approach to crafting a slasher film, and the downright brutal kills more than compensate for the downtime between them. Horror is subjective, and viewers shouldn't expect to lose their cookies just because someone else reportedly did. Instead, horror fans should have fun with a new, inventive slasher with gnarly kills and a marketing campaign that is going to freak out all the normies. But if you're an easily queasy viewer, maybe skip the icy before watching the movie, just to be safe.
A bloodthirsty clown and a saw trap so grisly that people passed out. These films were just too much for their audiences. 1999's The Blair Witch Project wasn't a mere hit, it was a phenomenon. Made on a budget of only about $500,000, the film went on to gross almost $250 million. It was one of the most talked about movies of the year. One of the reasons The Blair Witch performed so well at the box office was the incredibly clever marketing campaign they employed to hype up the masses. Using the internet, a novel notion at the time, the makers of The Blair Witch Project constructed an elaborate outside narrative about how the events of the film were very real, and that the actors in it did indeed meet a grisly demise. There were additional fake documents and additional found footage film made to back up the authenticity of the movie.
I'm scared to close my eyes. I'm scared to open them.
Some audience members were a little baffled when the actors, very much alive, would appear on talk shows to promote the film. The authenticity of the Blair Witch Project already gripped some audiences, but the real reason some people admitted to outright nausea was the film's constant use of handheld camera footage. The movie was actually filmed by the actors, and it was intentionally made to look like an amateur production. This meant no tripods, no Steadicams, and a lot of people leaving the camera running when they took off at a dead sprint. According to a report in the Washington Post, the swirling visuals were too much for some, and many reported having to rush to the bathroom to be sick. The Saw movies are, for an entire generation, synonymous with Halloween.
Hello, Amanda. You don't know me, but I know you. I want to play a game.
When the first Saw became a massive success in 2004, a sequel was rushed into production, which was ready to be seen in theaters the following October. A new Saw film came out every October thereafter for 5 years. With each sequel, the confusing continuity of the Saw movies would become that much more elaborate, and the gore would be ratcheted up to vomitorium levels. Saw 3 featured a scene wherein a victim was left at the bottom of an empty vat while fetid pig corpses were automatically fed into a meat mulching machine above. If the film's protagonist couldn't stop the pig corpses from coming through the chute, then the victim would drown in liquefied pig entrails. And that's only one disgusting scene in a film full of them. This is also the Saw movie that features a man with a large metal hoop pierced up through his chin and out of his mouth. He is invited by Mastermind Jigsaw to yank off his own jaw in order to escape. According to a 2006 report from the BBC, some people passed out and had to be attended to by medics. The reason was simple enough. Saw 3 was simply too much to bear. The poor souls couldn't possibly know about the horrors of the 6 additional Saw films that were to follow. They would hate them. Or love them if they happen to like movies so intense they pass out. After the success of Dracula in 1931, director Todd Browning was granted leeway to pursue a passion project he had long dreamed about. Browning was always fascinated by carnivals and traveling circuses, and at age 16 ran away from home to work in one. Yes, people did indeed run away and join the circus. For several years, he worked as a barker, a contortionist, and even performed a live burial act, wherein he billed himself as the living hypnotic corpse. Wanting to honor the circus workers in film, in particular the sideshow performers, Browning made the feature film Freaks in 1932, which starred a cast of real circus employees who were featured in the institution's notorious freak shows. Stories go that MGM employees were so unnerved by non-able-bodied actors visiting the studio lot that some of them, notably Daisy and Violet Hilton, had to rest inside tents out of the public eye. It was this sort of unfair prejudice that Browning was seeking to combat by making Freaks. The controversy continued into the film's release, and audiences were unready for a mainstream melodrama about the lives of circus sideshow performers. The main story of Freaks involves the sideshow performer Hans, who is seduced by and marries the circus trapeze artist Cleopatra, who intends to poison him and take his substantial inheritance. This is understandably upsetting for Hans's first wife, Frida, and Cleopatra's plan soon leaks its way out to the rest of the circus performers, who eventually attack Cleopatra with knives. The final scene reveals that Cleopatra has been transformed into a bizarre chicken woman and is now on display as part of the circus sideshow she dared to disrespect. Anyone who has seen The Elephant Man likely knows the way circus sideshows exaggerate the backstories behind the unusual proportions of their freaks. In The Elephant Man, John Merrick's mother was terrified by elephants while pregnant, and the movie Freaks received an equally exaggerated legend about how the film was so terrifying and the people in it so unusual that a young mother watching the movie miscarried her pregnancy. There is no documented evidence of this, but the legend persists.
What exactly was it about this movie that had moviegoers the world over blowing chunks into their bags of popcorn? An old legend of cinema goes that the pioneering Lumiere brothers' 1896 film, The Arrival of a Train, had new-to-the-media moviegoers scrambling in a panic to flee from an on-screen locomotive as it pulls into a train station. Because the camera is situated at the end of the platform, it looked like the train would burst through the screen. While there's no hard evidence that the incident ever happened, the story illustrated how effective camera work can be in disrupting a viewer's perception to the point of emotional and physical extremes. Thus, audiences and their sense of equilibrium have been hostage to genre films ever since. Fast forward to 2007, when producer and director J.J. Abrams decided America needed its own monster that wasn't King Kong. The result was Cloverfield, a clever mashup of a kaiju thriller with a found-footage horror movie. Set in New York City as a cluster of 20-somethings at a farewell party capture a large-scale monster attack, the story is presented via personal camcorder, with nary a Steadicam gimbal in sight. While adding to the story's authenticity, the cinematography results in the dreaded shaky cam effect found footage movies are now known for, prompting widespread reports of motion sickness among audience members at the film screenings. But why? Well, as it turns out, all that retching and misery have a pretty straightforward scientific explanation. So, why does Matt Reeves' Cloverfield make folks lose their lunch? It's just a bit of visual side to side for 85 minutes straight, which isn't disorienting at all, right?
I don't feel so good.
Okay, yeah, it is pretty bad. University of Toronto professor Bob Chung, who examines motion sickness at the Institute's Department of Physiology, points at mind-body confusion as the root cause of what he calls, quote, simulated sickness. About 15 to 20% of people have an inner ear abnormality that can make them sensitive to a specific bit of sensory input, Chung told the Toronto Star. Because it was filmed from a first-person perspective, the optic flow is coming toward you, making you feel like you are moving forward when in fact you are sitting in a chair. This sensory conflict is between what your eyes are visually telling you and what your other sensors that govern orientation are telling you. Some people are able to resolve this very quickly, and some can't. So what solutions are available? Short of popping a Dramamine before the show begins, one answer is to sit at the back of the theater. Cinephiles may balk at the idea, but Chung recommends limiting immersion with the screen and disrupting the optic flow by simply sitting as far away as possible. It works in the same way motion sickness does during car rides, focusing on static, faraway objects rather than repetitive, close stuff like trees and lampposts can keep the queasiness at bay. It's not exactly how Christopher Nolan would want a viewer to engage with his movies, but if it works, it works. Cloverfield is far from the only offender when it comes to simulated sickness. Movie Hurl, a site that rates movies according to their motion sickness factor, lists Cloverfield as a Hall of Shamer, an honor given to the most commonly cited films that churn the stomach. But the film is only at the number 6 spot. The movie with the worst nausea rating had a fraction of the Cloverfield budget, but had audiences reaching for barf bags all the same. The Blair Witch Project was a 90s indie picture that had its captive audiences too scared to close their eyes and too sick to open them. Following a trio of film students armed with cameras in pursuit of a local legend, the directors used a bit of the old and new for their sick-making, subjecting viewers to shaky footage via 16mm film and a Sony Hi8 camcorder. The New York Post reported on waves of upset stomachs and dizziness at screenings across the country, but the film's worldwide gross of over $248 million heralded a rise in found footage fare, one that would yield pop culture heirs like Blumhouse's Paranormal Activity and Barry Levinson's shaky cam mockumentary, The Bay.
There is perhaps no greater honor a horror filmmaker can receive than to hear that their film made audiences ill. Here are some horror movies that made audiences physically sick in theaters. Macabre was director William Castle's 40th feature film, but really it was his first, at least as an independent creative. Castle, who previously made movies for Columbia and other studios, began branching out into horror movies in the late 1950s, after a long career of studio-mandated westerns and other genre cheapies. By that point in his career, Castle, always interested in gore and horror, understood that in order to sell a movie to a young, hungry audience, one must have an angle, a gimmick, if you will. Castle, tapping into a very general paranoia about extreme horror films killing their audience members, openly proclaimed in the advertising for Macabre that there was a very real possibility you may die of fright.
Bring someone with you to see this motion picture. You'll want some live hands to hold during the performance.
If true, this would have been a headache from an insurance standpoint, so Castle acted accordingly. Upon arrival at the theater, audience members were handed a certificate for a life insurance policy, backed by Lloyd's of London, that would award the viewer $1,000, which is equivalent to about $9,700 in 2022, should they die of fright in the theater. Additionally, Castle hired actors to dress as nurses and remain on standby in theater lobbies to check the vitals of anyone who might be close to death due to Macabre's intense scenes. Macabre, by the way, is merely a fun potboiler that features a kidnapped child and someone being sealed inside a coffin alive. While possessed of an EC Comics-like wickedness, there is nothing so horrifying as to scare you to death. Nonetheless, and one can posit that this was to attract the attention of the pretty actresses hired to play the nurses, there are a few stories of young men fainting in the theater because Macabre was just that scary. Regardless, the gimmick was a hit. Macabre made millions, and Castle made several of the best horror movies of all time with even more elaborate gimmicks in the future. The Exorcist is often called the scariest film of all time, and until 2017, with the release of It Chapter 1, the highest-grossing horror film in history. That said, William Friedkin's horror masterpiece has no shortage of legends associated with its reputation. Not only are the film's curses part of public record, and were even covered in the debut episode of Shudder's Cursed Films documentary series, but audience reaction to The Exorcist was intense and dramatic. Stories persist to this day that certain moments in The Exorcist cause audience members to faint.
Did you do that?
The most notorious scene, and the one that has the legends attached to it, involves the 12-year-old Reagan McNeil doing something immensely horrible with a crucifix. This is a scene that was also featured in the William Peter Blatty novel upon which the film was based. It was this scene that allegedly inspired the legendary fits of unconsciousness. Add to that scene any number of horrifying images, such as projectile vomit, heads turning backward, or levitation, and you have a shockingly scary movie that has truly stood the test of time. Notoriously walked out on at the Cannes Film Festival and often considered one of the most disturbing feature films ever made, Gaspar Noé's Irreversible set out to make audiences sick. With a message of time destroys everything and told in reverse scene order, Irreversible is one of the most aggressive and perhaps one of the more pessimistic movies ever made. It also contains a notorious sexual assault scene wherein Monica Bellucci, who directed the scene herself, is attacked in an underground passage. It's incredibly difficult to watch no matter how desensitized you are. Not at all content to merely shock audiences with an extended scene of extreme sexual violence, Noé also used an experimental sound technique during the film's early scenes, employing ultra-low frequency bass notes that had previously been developed as a non-lethal weapon intended for use on the battlefields of World War II. Certain low sounds have been known to induce nausea, and Noé wanted his audience to feel that nausea. Add to that a severe beating in a club, loud music, and flashing strobe effects, then you have a vomiting audience just waiting to happen. Mercifully, the film's violence is relegated to its first half, and the falling action lets audiences recover. Nonetheless, the horror of the opening scenes lingered with audiences and left many feeling physically ill, leading some to flee the theater, struck by fits of queasiness. However, if the goal of the film was to leave people feeling ill, then Irreversible was a rousing success. Hungarian filmmaker György Palfi's 2006 film Taxidermia is a difficult one to stomach. Presented in vignettes, the film follows several generations of men as they face the darkest appetites of their bodies. This involves trauma to sensitive areas, violating a pig corpse, a great deal of overeating, and a climax wherein a character uses an elaborate machine to remove their own internal organs. Partly a meditation on the nature of our relationships to our physical forms, and partly a grand guignol horror oddity, no one will leave Taxidermia without several disturbing images burned into their brains.
Come on, let's go! Why are they doing this? Just run!
There are plenty of dark and gross moments to choose from, so it's difficult to say which moment in particular inspired the most vomiting. But vomit audience members did. Anecdotally, as someone who worked in a movie theater where Taxidermia played in 2006, audiences had to step out during the competitive eating scenes, wherein two of the main characters hastily shove large quantities of gelatinous meat-like substances into their mouths. The film also experienced walkouts during the final self-taxidermy scenes, as there are numerous close-ups of actual pulsating organs. It's unclear how Palfi achieved these effects. It's safe to say we've heard more dry heaves during Taxidermia than in any other movie, unless you count those we suffered during the latest Space Jam film. Lars von Trier's 2009 film Antichrist is the first part of what has come to be called the Depression Trilogy, which also includes 2011's Melancholia and 2013's Nymphomaniac. All three films delve into the intimate details of the depressed mind, exploring the unusual connections our brains manifest when soaked in sadness and mourning. In this, sex and death become interlinked. The natural world becomes dank and forbidding.
Chaos reigns.
Our relationships to others become hateful and suspect. The invading force of depression often lies, convincing you that you have no self-worth. Lars von Trier struggled with severe suicidal depression for many years, and he was uncompromising when he put his own emotional state on camera in Antichrist, using actress Charlotte Gainsbourg as his mouthpiece and Willem Dafoe as the obnoxious male who insists on analyzing away something that is too overwhelming to ever be analyzed. Antichrist is about a wife and a husband who recently lost their young child to an unfortunate accident while they were making love in the shower. The sadness and mourning following the event leads to a retreat to a remote cabin in the woods, as scary and foreboding as anything from an Evil Dead movie, to heal. Needless to say, they do not heal. Madness begins to infect them both, and the film climaxes with Gainsbourg attacking Dafoe, inflicting some horrid genital trauma and screwing a lodestone through his leg. We here at SlashFilm can personally attest to the film's nauseating effects, as not only did the movie make some of us feel ill the first time we saw it, but we also witnessed moviegoers leave the theater in visible disgust during its more gruesome scenes. It will take a strong constitution to see Antichrist, but the film will reward you with an accurate portrait of what it feels like to be depressed, something that not all people have the ability to understand. When it debuted at the Toronto International Film Festival, Julia Ducournau's Raw inspired calls to the paramedics. Reports from the venue said that several audience members had passed out during the screening. Given the film's cannibalistic subject matter, it's easy to see why. Raw, true to its title, features a lot of chewing on uncooked meats, and in several notable sequences, human meat that's still alive. Additionally, there is a scene in Raw where a real horse is actually anesthetized on camera, which only added to the fleshy authenticity of the film. Don't worry though, there's no need to make an urgent phone call to your local PETA representative. The horse was okay.
Ducournau, with Raw and her latest film, Titan, appears to have an emerging thesis in her body of work about our human flesh prisons and our slavery to them. We are our bodies, and our appetites rule us. That the cannibalism in Raw was presented so frankly may have a lot to do with the reaction it got at TIFF. This is no Wicked Game or exploitation movie. This is a movie that confronts audiences in grotesque but meaningful ways, and it's to Ducournau's credit that she was so effectively able to get under everyone's skin. While the above films made people sick, the 2018 Canadian mockumentary Antrum, the deadliest film ever made, is the only one that claims it will kill you right in the title. Perhaps taking inspiration from John Carpenter's films In the Mouth of Madness and his Masters of Horror episode Cigarette Burns, both of which featured fictional films that cause viewers to go mad. Antrum is a movie about a fictional movie that has a 100% fatality rate among its viewers. Staged in BBC documentary style, it involves a lot of convincing period detail as it unfolds the style of a mad European filmmaker in the 1970s, whose film was infected with a curse. Think The Ring via Cannibal Holocaust. A disclaimer at the head of the film declares, Antrum is not safe.
One by one we pray to thee, protect us from all we'll see.
As far as we've been able to discern, no viewers of Antrum have actually died after watching it. However, any claim that a film is so scary it might kill us is certainly going to attract our attention. After all, what better way for a cinephile to go out than to be killed by a film? That being said, we implore you to make some popcorn and watch the film that's built around the ultimate horror movie promise.